The biggest central banks in the world are now offering cheap dollar loans to prevent the global financial crisis from getting worse. It is a desperate measure by the central banks of the US, the Euro region, Canada, the UK, Japan and Switzerland. Unexpectedly, together they issued a statement saying they want to take the pressure off banks and consequently markets, and they agreed to lower interest rates on dollar loans to banks which need those US dollars to carry out their day-to-day transaction. This, it's hoped, should free up cash which could then be lent to households and to businesses. Well, central banks outside the Eurozone know that their countries need a healthier Europe for their exports, and the US president knows in turn that a failed euro could hurt the US economy and consequently next year his re-election. Well, joining us from Washington, D.C., Pat Garofalo, Economic Policy Editor at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. First question, Pat, is this going to do the trick?
It's going to help a little bit on the margins. What the Fed is doing and what the European Central Bank is doing is they're trying to avoid a repeat of 2008 when there was a huge credit crunch. This should help with that problem, avoid seeing what we saw in 2008 where credit seized up all across the board. But this doesn't help any of the bigger structural problems in Europe.
Let's clear up something that is confusing us a little bit here, and I know other people. Is this money simply going to help the Eurozone, or the cheap dollars in Japan, will that help Japanese banks?
It's very possible. The way it's working is it goes from the U.S. Central Bank to the European Central Bank, and then it's at the European Central Bank's discretion where the next hop is. So it's very possible that it helps across the board, although I think the main purpose from the U.S. Federal Reserve's mind is to help Europe.
But when we see the Bank of Japan doing something like this, is it going to be lending the money to the European Central Bank and then the Euro banks, or is this going to stay in Japan?
I believe because of the coordination that it's going to be going all across the board.
Okay, now let's take Europe as an example here. 16% down on business loans in the third quarter of this year. That is such a drop that something like this is only going to help for a short period of time, isn't it?
And that's exactly right. This doesn't help any of the bigger structural problems. This doesn't really stem the fiscal crisis in any significant way. It certainly doesn't bring down unemployment in any of the countries where it needs to come down. So, like I said, this will help prevent a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis when we saw credit seize up and we saw bankers panicking left and right. But this doesn't help any of the bigger structural problems, and it doesn't end the fiscal crisis in Europe by any stretch of the imagination.
When you see something like the Central Bank of China saying it's going to, what's it called? Its reserve requirement ratios are going to be eased. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that means. Perhaps you can tell us. But is the timing coincidental, or was this coordinated as well?
What that means is that Chinese banks will have to hold less in reserve. Basically, their capital requirements are going to go down a little bit from where they have been. It seems coordinated in the sense that that central banks are acting across the board, and so it makes sense for China to do it too. I'm not sure how much strategic behind-the-board talking there's been going on between the central bankers, but it makes sense that if Europe and the U.S. and Japan are all acting, that China would do the same. If
you all act together, it could work, or you could all fail together.
Right, these aren't the riskiest maneuvers that central banks could be taking, and I think it will help on the margins. But again, this is aimed at one specific problem about easing lending a little bit. It doesn't help any of the bigger structural problems.
And that's what they're working on in other parts of the world. Pat, thank you very much indeed. Pat Garofalo there from Washington, D.C. These European governments, meanwhile, as I mentioned, have been trying to contain the crisis. Finance ministers across the EU have been told they have only 10 days now to save the euro.